Sometimes the most unlikely partnerships are forged in the most desperate moments. When Ruth Kelton's barn roof leaked like a broken promise and foreclosure loomed over her Nebraska ranch, a homeless cowboy named Dusty Rowan appeared at her gate with nothing but skilled hands and an empty belly. What started as a simple trade roof, repair for a hot meal, became something that would shake the very foundations of their small farming community. Ruth made a decision that stunned everyone. She offered this drifter a full partnership in her struggling ranch, splitting the profits 50-50 if they could save her land together. The townsfolk called her foolish, whispered about scandal, and predicted disaster. But as autumn turned to winter, and the unlikely pair worked side by side, mending fences and herding cattle, something beautiful began to emerge from their shared struggle. Two broken souls, both carrying the weight of loss and loneliness, discovered that sometimes salvation comes not from what we can give ourselves, but from what we're willing to share with another. What happens when a community realizes that the partnership they mocked might just be the most powerful force for change they've ever witnessed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Nebraska sandhills, painting the prairie grass in shades of gold and amber that reminded Ruth Kelton of better times. She stood on the weathered wooden ladder, her calloused hands gripping a bundle of cedar shingles that felt heavier than they should have. Above her, the barn roof gaped like an open wound, revealing patches of sky through holes that had grown larger with each passing storm. The autumn rain of 1888 had been merciless, and what had once been her late husband's pride, a sturdy barn that could weather any tempest, now leaked like a sieve. Ruth paused in her work, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her sleeve. At 42, she had the lean strength of a woman who had known hard work all her life, but her body protested the unfamiliar demands of roofing. Her hands, more accustomed to kneading bread and tending gardens, ached from gripping the hammer. Below her, the barn's interior bore the stains of countless leaks, and she could smell the musty dampness that threatened to ruin what little hay she had managed to harvest. The ranch stretched out before her in rolling waves of prairie grass, punctuated by clusters of cottonwood trees that marked the meandering path of Sand Creek. It was beautiful land-rich soil that could support cattle and crops alike, but beauty didn't pay the taxes that were piling up like autumn leaves. Since Thomas had died of pneumonia the previous winter, Ruth had discovered just how much of their financial dealings he had kept to himself. The books told a story she hadn't known: mounting debts, missed payments, and creditors who had been patient only out of respect for her husband's memory. Inside the house, Thomas's tool chest sat on the kitchen table where she had dragged it that morning. The mahogany box was worn smooth by his hands, and each tool inside bore the marks of decades of use. She had been trying to learn their purposes through trial and error, but roofing required skills that couldn't be mastered overnight. The hammer felt clumsy in her grip, and she had already bent 2 nails trying to secure the shingles properly. The isolation pressed down on her, as heavily as the Nebraska sky. Their nearest neighbors, the Hendersons, lived 3 miles to the east, and while they were kind enough, Ruth sensed their discomfort around her widowhood. Women alone were an anomaly in this country, a reminder of mortality that made families uneasy. The weekly trips to town for supplies had become exercises in enduring pitying looks and whispered conversations that stopped when she entered the general store. It was while she struggled with a particularly stubborn shingle that she first spotted the figure on the horizon. A lone rider approached along the wagon track that connected her ranch to the main road, moving with the unhurried pace of someone who had nowhere urgent to be. As the figure drew closer, Ruth could make out the details. A man astride a tired-looking sorrel horse, his hat pulled low against the morning sun. He rode with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle, but there was something in his posture that spoke of weariness deeper than simple fatigue. Jack, Dusty Rowan had been riding these Nebraska trails for the better part of 3 years, drifting from ranch to ranch, taking work where he could find it and moving on when the seasons changed or the welcome wore thin. At 38, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had learned to live with less than most and make peace with solitude. His clothes were worn but clean, patched in places but mended with care. The bedroll tied behind his saddle contained everything he owned: a spare shirt, a worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets, and a small leather pouch holding the last $5 to his name. The horse beneath him, a mare named Ginger, had been his companion for 2 years. She was past her prime but reliable, with intelligent eyes and a gentle disposition that matched her rider's temperament. Dusty had won her in a poker game in Cheyenne, though he suspected the previous owner had been more interested in finding her a good home than in keeping his losing hand out as he approached the ranch. Dusty's experienced eye took in the details. That told the story of the place. The house was well maintained, with a coat of white paint that was only beginning to fade and a wraparound porch that spoke of better times. The vegetable garden beside it showed signs of careful tending, with neat rows of late-season vegetables protected by chicken wire. But the barn was another story entirely. Even from a distance, he could see the woman on the ladder struggling with the roof, and the way she favored her left arm suggested she had been at the work for some time. The corrals were empty, except for a single milk cow and a pair of draft horses that looked well fed but underworked. A few chickens scratched in the dirt near the barn, and a dog, an old blue heeler with graying muzzle, rose from the porch shade to watch his approach with mild interest but no alarm. It was the picture of a small operation run by someone who cared but lacked the manpower to keep everything in proper order. Dusty had seen enough struggling homesteads to recognize the signs. The woman on the ladder was likely a widow. Her black dress, though practical for work, still bore the marks of mourning. The way she held herself, with determined dignity despite obvious exhaustion, reminded him of his own mother, who had tried to keep their small Tennessee farm running after his father's death 30 years ago. He reined in Ginger at a respectful distance and touched the brim of his hat. "Morning, ma'am," he called up to her, his voice carrying the soft drawl of his southern upbringing. "Looks like you could use a hand with that roof." Ruth startled at the sound, nearly dropping her hammer. She had been so focused on her work that she hadn't heard his approach. Looking down at him, she saw a man with weathered features and kind eyes, his dark hair showing threads of silver at the temples. There was something about his posture respectful, but not servile, confident, but not presumptuous. It set her at ease, despite her natural wariness of strangers. "I'm managing well enough," she replied, though her aching muscles argued otherwise. Her voice carried the slight German accent of her childhood, softened by decades in America, but still detectable in moments of stress. Dusty nodded, recognizing the pride that made accepting help difficult. He had felt it himself many times. "Yes, ma'am, I can see that. But I've done my share of roofing, and I notice you're fighting that southeast corner there. Tricky spot needs to be sealed just right, or the winter winds will find their way through." Despite herself, Ruth was intrigued. The corner he mentioned was indeed giving her trouble, and she had been wondering if she was approaching it correctly. "And what would you know about it?" she asked, not unkindly. "Worked construction in Kansas City for a spell before I took to ranching," Dusty replied. "Roofed everything from barns to churches. That corner there needs a different approach, overlapping the shingles contrary to what seems natural, on account of how the wind hits it." Ruth studied his face, looking for signs of the smooth talk that often preceded requests for money or trouble. But his expression was earnest, and his hands, she had learned to read men's hands since Thomas died, were the hands of someone who knew honest work. Calloused but clean, with scars that spoke of tools and rope rather than fights and vice. "What would you want in return?" she asked directly. In her experience, help always came with a price. Dusty glanced toward the house, where the smell of baking bread drifted from the kitchen window. His stomach, which had known only hardtack and creek water for the past 2 days, responded with an audible growl. He had the grace to look embarrassed. "Well, ma'am, I was wondering if you might spare a meal for a man who's been too long between kitchens. Nothing fancy, just something hot and filling. In exchange, I'll have that roof tight, enough to shed water like a duck's back, and you'll have it done before sundown." Ruth considered the offer. She had been working on the roof for 3 days with little progress, and her body protested each morning when she climbed the ladder. The sensible part of her mind, the part that had learned caution in the months since Thomas's death, warned against trusting a stranger. But there was something about this soft-spoken drifter that reminded her of the good men she had known, her father, her husband, the neighbors who had helped raise barn walls and shared harvest. "Meals in better times. You'll work for just a meal?" she asked, still skeptical. "Ma'am, I've learned that a home-cooked meal shared with good company is worth more than most folks realize. I don't ask for charity, but I'm not too proud to work for something I need." The honesty in his voice decided her. "All right, Mr. Rowan." "Ma'am, Jack Rowan, though most folks call me Dusty." "Mr. Rowan, I'm Ruth Kelton. If you can truly fix this roof, I'll be grateful for the help." Dusty dismounted and began unloading his saddlebags. From them, he produced a well-maintained set of carpenter's tools: hammer, nails, measuring square, and a small saw that gleamed despite its obvious age. Ruth watched as he studied the roof with the eye of an expert, pointing out problem areas and explaining his approach in terms she could understand. As the morning progressed, Ruth found herself watching Dusty work with growing admiration. His movements were economical and sure, wasting no motion or materials. He worked steadily, but not frantically, taking time to do each task properly rather than rushing toward completion. When he encountered problems, a rotten board that needed replacing, a section where the previous repair had been poorly done, he consulted with her before proceeding, treating her as the owner of the property rather than an inconvenience to be worked around. By midday, the difference was remarkable. The holes that had plagued Ruth for weeks were sealed, and the entire southeast corner had been rebuilt with an attention to detail that would ensure it lasted for years. Dusty worked through the heat of the afternoon, pausing only to water his horse and accept the glass of cool well water that Ruth brought him. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, Dusty climbed down from the roof and surveyed his work with quiet satisfaction. The barn now stood whole and weather-tight, its new shingles blending seamlessly with the old. "That should keep the rain out through the worst of winter," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "You've got good bones in this barn built to last." By someone who knew his craft. Ruth looked up at the completed roof, scarcely believing the transformation. "My husband built it," she said softly. "He always said it would outlast us both." There was a moment of comfortable silence as they both contemplated the structure that represented so much more than shelter. Then Ruth stirred herself back to the present. "I believe I owe you a meal, Mr. Rowan. If you'd like to wash up at the pump, I'll have supper ready shortly." As Dusty led his horse to the water trough and began the ritual of evening care, Ruth hurried to the kitchen to prepare the meal she had promised. The bread she had baked that morning was still warm, and she had a pot of beef stew that had been simmering since dawn. It was more food than she usually prepared for herself, but something about the day, the accomplishment of the completed roof, the pleasure of useful company, made her want to set a proper table. She found herself humming as she worked, a habit she had lost in the months since Thomas's death. The kitchen felt more alive with the knowledge that someone would soon share her table, that her cooking would nourish more than just her own lonely existence. The evening meal passed in comfortable conversation, with Dusty proving to be a thoughtful dinner companion who asked genuine questions about the ranch and listened carefully to Ruth's answers. When she served him the stew, she found herself ladling out a larger portion than she had intended, moved by the hollow look in his cheeks and the way he savored each bite as if it were a feast. They spoke of practical things, the land, the weather, the challenges of working a ranch alone, but beneath the surface conversation, Ruth sensed a deeper understanding passing between them. Not as darkness settled over the prairie, Dusty prepared to take his leave. He gathered his tools with the same methodical care he had shown in using them, wrapping each one carefully before placing it in his saddlebags. Ruth watched from the porch, oddly reluctant to see him go. The evening had reminded her of how much she missed adult conversation, the simple pleasure of sharing her thoughts with someone who listened without judgment. "Thank you for the meal, Mrs. Kelton," Dusty said, settling his hat on his head. "It was the finest I've had in a considerable time." "Thank you for the roof," Ruth replied. "I don't know how I would have managed it alone." Dusty mounted Ginger and touched his hat brim in farewell. "You would have found a way. That's clear enough to anyone with eyes to see." He paused, as if considering whether to say more, then simply nodded. "Good evening, ma'am." Ruth watched until his silhouette disappeared into the darkness, then went inside to clean the dishes and bank the fire. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with mere survival. The roof was fixed, the barn was secure, and she had managed to provide proper hospitality to a stranger in need. It was a small victory, but it felt significant in ways she couldn't quite articulate. She slept better that night than she had in weeks, lulled by the absence of the familiar drip, drip, drip that had marked every rainstorm since spring. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with the crisp edge that promised an early winter. Ruth was feeding the chickens when she heard the sound of multiple horses approaching. Looking toward the road, she saw a small group of riders coming up the trackmen she recognized from town, their faces grave with official business dotted there. Head rode Sheriff Millbrook, a decent man who had known Thomas well and had been kind to Ruth in the months since his death. Beside him rode Ezra Hutchins, the bank president, his round face set in lines of uncomfortable duty. Behind them came two other men Ruth recognized, members of the county commission who handled property auctions and tax collections. Her heart sank as she realized the purpose of their visit. She had known this day was coming, had been dreading it for weeks, but somehow the hope engendered by yesterday's small victory had made her forget, temporarily, the larger crisis that loomed over her life. "Morning, Ruth," Sheriff Millbrook said, dismounting with obvious reluctance. He held a folded paper in his hands, and his eyes couldn't quite meet hers. "I'm afraid this is official business." "I know what it is, Harold," Ruth said quietly. She had prepared herself for this moment, but the reality of it still hit her like a physical blow. "You don't need to make it harder than it has to be." Hutchins cleared his throat and pulled out a larger document. "Mrs. Kelton, I'm afraid the bank has no choice but to proceed with foreclosure proceedings. The taxes on this property are 14 months in arrears, and the mortgage payments," he trailed off, his discomfort obvious. "How long do I have?" Ruth asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "The auction is set for tomorrow morning," Sheriff Millbrook said. "I'm sorry, Ruth. We tried to give you as much time as possible, hoping you might find a way to catch up the payments, but the county commissioners are under pressure from the state. They can't wait any longer." Ruth nodded, accepting the foreclosure. Notice with hands that remained steady despite the trembling in her chest. The paper felt heavier than it should have, weighted with the destruction of everything she and Thomas had built together. Tomorrow morning, strangers would bid on her life, reducing 30 years of marriage and partnership to dollars and cents. "Will there be many at the auction?" she asked, not sure why the answer mattered, but needing to know anyway. "Word has gotten around," one of the commissioners said apologetically. "There's been interest from several parties. The land is good, and the buildings are sound." After the men left, Ruth walked slowly around the property that would soon belong to someone else. A barn roof, so newly repaired, seemed to mock her with its integrity. What was the point of fixing things that would soon be taken away? She found herself in the barn, standing among the empty stalls that had once housed Thomas's cattle, sold off one by one to pay bills and buy time. It was there that Dusty found her when he returned an hour later. She heard Ginger's hoofbeats and looked up to see him dismounting in the yard, a puzzled expression on his weathered face. He had seen the official visitors leaving and recognized the signs of bad news in their posture and haste. "Mrs. Kelton?" he called, his voice carrying concern. "Is everything all right?" Ruth emerged from the barn, the foreclosure notice still clutched in her hand. She had been fighting tears for the past hour, but something about Dusty's genuine worry broke through her careful composure. "They're taking the ranch," she said simply. "Tomorrow morning. Auction for back taxes." Dusty's face darkened with understanding and sympathy. He had seen too many good people lose their land to hard times and heartless creditors. "How much do you owe?" "More than I can raise in a lifetime," Ruth replied with bitter honesty. $1,400 in taxes, plus the mortgage balance. Thomas was optimistic about our finances. He borrowed against future harvests that never came, made improvements we couldn't afford. I didn't know how bad it was until after he died. Dusty was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving over the ranch with the assessing gaze of someone who understood land and its value. "It's a good spread," he said finally. "Rich soil, good water, well positioned for cattle or crops. In better times, it would be worth 3 times what you owe." "But these aren't better times," Ruth said. "And I'm just one woman trying to work land that needs half a dozen hands." Dusty nodded slowly, then walked over to the barn and examined something that had caught his attention the day before. Behind the structure, partially hidden by overgrown weeds, was a stack of lumber that had been carefully covered and protected from the weather. He pulled back the tarpaulin and whistled softly. Double quotes, "Mrs. Kelton, did you know about this timber?" Ruth followed him and looked at the stack with new eyes. Thomas was always collecting wood for projects he planned to tackle someday. I'd forgotten it was there. Dusty ran his hands over the planks, testing their condition and estimating their value. "This is prime lumber oak and pine, seasoned and ready for use. There's enough here to build a dozen sections of good fence, maybe more. And over there," he pointed to another covered pile, "those are fence posts, cut and treated. Your husband was planning something big." "He talked about expanding the cattle operation," Ruth said slowly. "Fencing the north pasture and running more head. But he died before he could start the work." "The materials are here," Dusty said, excitement creeping into his voice. "The land is good, the water is reliable, and the buildings are sound. What this place needs is hands to work it and someone with the knowledge to manage cattle." Ruth looked at him with growing understanding. "You're talking about working the ranch, not just selling it." "I'm talking about saving it," Dusty replied. "If someone could get cattle on this land good breeding stock and fence the pastures properly, this place could turn a profit within 2 seasons. Enough profit to pay the taxes and start paying down the mortgage." "Someone," Ruth repeated. "But not me. I don't know the first thing about cattle ranching on that scale, but I do," Dusty said quietly. "I've worked cattle from Texas to Montana. I know breeding, grazing, marketing, everything it takes to run a successful operation. What I don't have is land or capital to start with." Ruth stared at him, beginning to understand the audacious idea that was forming in his mind. "You're suggesting a partnership?" "I'm suggesting we save your ranch together," Dusty said. You have the land and the materials. I have the knowledge and the willingness to work. If we can convince the creditors to give us a chance, we might be able to turn this place around. But how? The auction is tomorrow morning. By noon, this place will belong to someone else. Dusty was quiet for a moment, thinking hard. Then his face cleared with sudden resolution. What if we made the winning bid ourselves? With what money? With a partnership agreement that shows the creditors they'll get paid, Dusty said. If I sign on as your foreman and partner with a stake in the profits, it changes everything. It shows them this isn't just a desperate woman trying to hold on to a failing farm. It's a business venture with real potential. Ruth felt a flutter of hope mixed with terror. The idea was audacious, almost unthinkable by the standards of her community. Unmarried men and women didn't enter into business partnerships, especially not with strangers. A scandal alone would be enormous. People would talk, she said. People always talk, Dusty replied. The question is whether you care more about what they say or about keeping your home. Ruth looked around the ranch that represented everything she and Thomas had built together. The house where they had been happy, the barn where they had worked. Side by side, the land that had sustained them through good years and bad. Tomorrow, it would all be gone unless she found the courage to take a desperate gamble on a man she had known for exactly one day. What would you want in return? She asked. A fair share of the profits and a roof over my head, Dusty said. Nothing more than I'd earn working for wages, but with a stake in the success of the operation. Ruth took a deep breath, feeling as if she stood on the edge of a cliff with no choice but to jump or fall. If we do this, it has to be a real partnership. Equal say in decisions, equal responsibility for the work. Agreed, Dusty said. Extending his hand out, Ruth looked at the offered handshake, knowing that accepting it would change her life irrevocably. She thought of Thomas, of the dreams they had shared for this land, of the life they had built with their own hands and stubborn determination. Then she thought of losing it all to strangers who would never understand what it meant. She took Dusty's hand in her own, sealing the most important bargain of her life. The dawn of auction day broke gray and uncertain, with clouds gathering on the western horizon like harbingers of the storm to come. Ruth had barely slept, her mind churning with doubts about the decision she had made. In the harsh light of morning, the partnership with a near stranger seemed less like salvation and more like the desperate act of a woman with no other choices. Dusty arrived before sunrise, leading his horse and carrying himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had made peace with his decision overnight. He found Ruth in the kitchen, staring at a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. Having second thoughts? He asked gently, settling into the chair across from her. Third and fourth thoughts, Ruth admitted. Dusty, we barely know each other. What if this whole idea is madness? It might be, he said honestly. But sometimes madness is the only sane response to impossible circumstances. The question isn't whether it's risky. It's whether you're willing to fight for what's yours. They rode to town together in Ruth's wagon, the foreclosure notice and their hastily written partnership agreement carefully folded in her reticule. The document was simple little more than a statement of intent signed by both parties, but it represented their only hope of convincing the creditors to postpone the sale. The auction was to be held on the steps of the county courthouse, and by the time they arrived, a small crowd had already gathered. Ruth recognized most of the faces, neighboring ranchers looking for additional grazing land, a few speculators from back east who had been buying up distressed properties, and the inevitable collection of curiosity seekers drawn by the drama of financial ruin. Sheriff Millbrook stood near the courthouse steps, holding the official documents that would transfer ownership of Ruth's life to the highest bidder. He looked up as they approached, his expression shifting from surprise to confusion as he noticed Dusty at Ruth's side. Ruth, he said carefully, I didn't expect to see you here. "This is still my ranch until the gavel falls," Ruth replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I have the right to be present." The sheriff's eyes moved to Dusty, taking in his worn but respectable clothing and the way he carried himself with quiet dignity. "And you are?" "Jack Rowan," Dusty said, offering his hand. "Mrs. Kelton's business partner." The words hit the assembled crowd like a thunderclap. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, and heads turned to stare at the unlikely pair. Ruth felt the weight of their scrutiny, but forced herself to stand straight and meet their gazes without flinching. "Business partner?" Ezra Hutchins pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with indignation. "Ruth, what is the meaning of this?" Ruth pulled out their partnership agreement and handed it to the banker with hands that trembled only slightly. "Mr. Rowan and I have entered into a formal partnership to operate the ranch. He brings experience in cattle management, and I retain ownership of the land and buildings. We're proposing to restructure the debt and pay it off through ranch operations over the next 3 years. Hutchins scanned the document quickly, his frown deepening with each line. "This is highly irregular, Ruth. You can't simply invent a business partnership to avoid paying your debts." "I'm not avoiding anything," Ruth said firmly. "I'm proposing a way to pay everything I owe while keeping the ranch operational. Surely that's better for everyone than selling to the highest bidder and hoping they can make the land productive." A murmur ran through the crowd as people processed this unexpected development. Ruth could hear whispered conversations. Partnership with a stranger. Scandalous behavior. What would Thomas think? But not all the voices were disapproving. John Henderson, her nearest neighbor, stepped forward with a thoughtful expression. "Ruth, is this man qualified to manage cattle operations?" Dusty answered for himself. "I've worked ranches from the Brazos to the Yellowstone. Mr. Henderson, 15 years managing herds ranging from 50 head to over 1,000. I can provide references if needed." "What's your plan?" asked another voice from the crowd. It was Samuel Morrison, an older rancher who had known Thomas well and had always treated Ruth with respect. Ruth took a deep breath and began to outline the plan she and Dusty had developed during their late-night conversation. They would use Thomas's stockpiled lumber to fence the north pasture, then lease breeding cattle from other ranchers who were looking to expand their operations without acquiring more land. The profits from the cattle sales would go toward paying down the debt, with Ruth and Dusty splitting the remainder. "It's a sound plan," Morrison admitted grudgingly. "The land will support more cattle than Thomas ever ran, and having someone with experience manage the operation makes sense." He paused, studying Dusty carefully. "But partnerships like this, they're unusual." "Unusual times call for unusual solutions," Ruth replied, surprised by her own boldness. Hutchins was conferring quietly with the county commissioners, their conversation growing more heated by the moment. Finally, he turned back to address Ruth and the crowd. "Even if this partnership were legitimate," he said, "it doesn't change the fact that the taxes are still owed. How do you propose to pay $1,400 in back taxes when you couldn't manage the regular payments?" Ruth's heart sank. This was the weakness in their plan, the insurmountable obstacle that would destroy their hopes before they could begin. She felt Dusty's hand touch her arm gently, offering support, but she knew there was no answer to Hutchins's question. Then Morrison spoke up again. "Ezra, what if the community guaranteed the tax payment?" The banker stared at him in astonishment. "What are you suggesting, Samuel?" "I'm suggesting that those of us who knew Thomas Kelton and respected him might be willing to help his widow." "Save their ranch," Morrison said. "Not charity, a business arrangement. We advance the tax money in exchange for a percentage of the cattle profits until we're repaid with interest." John Henderson nodded slowly. "It could work. The land is good, and if this fellow Rowan knows cattle like he claims, there's no reason the operation shouldn't succeed." Ruth stared at her neighbors in amazement, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. These were practical men, not given to romantic gestures or sentimental charity. If they were willing to invest their own money in her ranch, it meant they genuinely believed the plan could work. But Hutchins was shaking his head. "Gentlemen, I appreciate your desire to help, but the bank has responsibilities to its depositors. We can't simply ignore our procedures because of personal relationships." "Nobody's asking you to ignore anything," Morrison replied sharply. "We're proposing a legitimate business arrangement that ensures everyone gets paid. What more do you want?" The argument continued for several more minutes, with voices rising and tempers beginning to fray. Ruth found herself caught between hope and despair, watching her future being debated like a commodity to be bought and sold. It was Dusty who finally cut through the debate with quiet authority. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying easily over the crowd, "you're arguing about money, but you're missing the real question here. Mrs. Kelton isn't asking for charity or special treatment. She's asking for the chance to work for what's hers. That's the American way, isn't it? The chance to succeed or fail based on your own efforts." His words seemed to crystallize something in the crowd's mood. These were people who had built their lives through hard work and determination, who understood the value of second chances and the importance of standing by one's neighbors. Sheriff Millbrook, who had been listening to the debate with growing discomfort, finally stepped forward. "Ezra, what if we postpone the auction for 30 days? Give Mrs. Kelton and her partner a chance to prove their plan can work. If they can make the first payment and show progress toward clearing the debt, we continue with the arrangement. If not, we proceed with the sale." It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but offered everyone something they could accept. Hutchins got his assurance that the debt would eventually be paid. Morrison and the other neighbors got the satisfaction of helping without taking unreasonable risks. Ruth got the chance she desperately needed. But as the crowd began to disperse and the immediate crisis passed, Ruth realized that the real work was just beginning. She had bought herself 30 days to prove that a widow and a drifter could succeed, where a husband and wife had struggled. 30 days to transform a failing farm into a profitable ranch. 30 days to justify the faith that her neighbors had placed in her and the trust she had placed in a man she barely knew. As they rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon sun, Ruth felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Like a heavy yoke, a partnership that had seemed like salvation now felt like the beginning of the hardest work of her life. The first week of their partnership tested both Ruth and Dusty in ways neither had anticipated. What had seemed like a straightforward plan on paper revealed itself to be a complex web of challenges that required constant adaptation and compromise. Dusty moved into the small room above the barn, a space that had once housed seasonal workers during harvest time. It was sparse but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out over the north pasture. The arrangement satisfied the proprieties. He was clearly an employee rather than a boarder in the main house, while providing him with shelter, and Ruth with the comfort of knowing help was always nearby. Their first task was fencing the north pasture, and it was here that the differences in their backgrounds became most apparent. Ruth approached the work with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to domestic tasks, measuring twice and cutting once, ensuring that each post was perfectly aligned with the next. Dusty worked with the efficient speed of someone who had learned to accomplish maximum results with minimum effort, his experienced eye telling him where corners could be cut without compromising the integrity of the work. "Mrs. Kelton," he said on the third morning, watching her struggle to dig a post hole to the exact depth specified in Thomas's old farming manual, "sometimes good enough is better than perfect. This fence needs to contain cattle, not win a county. Fair competition." Ruth straightened, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. Thomas always said that anything worth doing was worth doing right. "And he was correct," Dusty replied gently. "But right doesn't always mean perfect." Bright means appropriate to the purpose. These posts will hold the fence, and the fence will hold the cattle. That's what matters. It was a small disagreement, but it highlighted the fundamental difference in their approaches to work and life. Ruth had learned to find security in precision and order, while Dusty had learned to find success in adaptability and efficiency. Neither approach was wrong, but they would need to find a middle ground if their partnership was to succeed. The physical demands of the work were equally challenging. Ruth's hands, soft from months of lighter domestic duties, quickly developed blisters and calluses. Her back ached from lifting fence posts, and her shoulders burned from wielding the heavy post-hole digger. But she persisted, driven by the knowledge that her home depended on her ability to match Dusty's work pace. Dusty, for his part, found himself adjusting his usual lone wolf approach to accommodate a partner. He was accustomed to making decisions quickly and implementing them immediately, but now he had to consult with Ruth, explain his reasoning, and sometimes accept her suggestions even when they differed from his instincts. "We need to talk about the cattle," he said one evening as they sat on the porch after another long day of fencing. "Morrison and Henderson have agreed to lease us breeding stock, but we need to decide how many head to start with." Ruth pulled out the ledger book she had been using to track their expenses and progress. Since taking on the partnership, she had become meticulous about recording every detail of their operation, partly from necessity and partly from a need to feel in control of something in her rapidly changing life. "We can afford to lease 20 head," she said, running her finger down the columns of figures. "That gives us a cushion for unexpected expenses and still leaves enough for the first payment to the bank." Dusty shook his head. 20 head won't generate enough profit to make this work. We need at least 40, preferably 50. But if something goes wrong, if we lose cattle to disease or predators, we'll be ruined. If we don't take enough cattle to make a real profit, we'll be ruined anyway," Dusty countered. "Ruth, this isn't a time for safe choices. We need to succeed, not just survive." The discussion continued for over an hour, with Ruth's natural caution clashing against Dusty's calculated boldness. Finally, they reached a compromise: 30 head to start, with the option to add more if the initial group prospered. It was during these evening conversations that Ruth began to understand the man she had chosen as her partner. Dusty spoke little about his past, but small details emerged in their discussions: a childhood on a Tennessee farm, parents who had died when he was barely grown, a brief and unhappy marriage that had ended in tragedy. He had been drifting ever since, working when he could find it, moving on when circumstances or inclination dictated. "Why did you agree to this partnership?" Ruth asked one evening, the question that had been troubling her since their first handshake. Dusty was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon where the last light of day was fading into darkness. "I suppose I got tired of moving on," he said finally. "Tired of having nothing to show for my work except the money in my pocket. This partnership, it's a chance to build something instead of just surviving day to day." Ruth nodded, understanding more than he perhaps realized. "I know what you mean. Since Thomas died, I felt like I was just marking time, trying to hold on to the past instead of building a future." "And now?" Dusty asked. Ruth looked around the ranch, at the half-completed fence, the repaired barn, the signs of their hard work everywhere she looked. "Now I feel like I'm living again instead of just existing." The confession surprised her with its honesty. Somewhere in the exhausting days of physical labor and the challenging negotiations of their partnership, she had rediscovered the satisfaction of meaningful work. Her hands might be rough and her back might ache, but she felt more alive than she had in months. Their progress was measured not just in completed fence sections, but in the small accommodations they made to each other's work styles and living habits. Ruth learned to trust Dusty's experience and judgment, while Dusty learned to appreciate Ruth's attention to detail and long-term planning. They developed routines that maximized their efficiency. Ruth would prepare breakfast while Dusty tended the horses. Then they would work together on the major projects, before splitting up for individual tasks in the afternoon. But the partnership faced its first real test at the end of their second week, when Samuel Morrison arrived with the first delivery of cattle. The animals were beautiful, sleek Herefords with the distinctive white faces that marked quality breeding stock. But as they unloaded from Morrison's wagon, Ruth felt a moment of panic. These were valuable animals, worth far more than anything she had ever been responsible for. If something happened to them, if they died or were stolen or simply wandered off, the financial consequences would be catastrophic. "They're magnificent," she told Morrison, trying to keep the anxiety out of her voice. "They should be," Morrison replied. "Each one of those cows is worth more than most people make in a year. But they're also proven mothers, and if you take care of them properly, they'll more than pay for themselves." Dusty had been examining the cattle with the expert eye of someone who had evaluated thousands of animals over the years. Now he approached Morrison with a slight frown. "That red cow there, she's favoring her left front leg." Morrison looked where Dusty was pointing and nodded. "Picked up a stone bruise about a week ago. It's healing fine, but she need to be watched for a few more days." "What does that mean for breeding?" Ruth asked, her anxiety increasing. "Nothing serious," Dusty assured her. "A few days of light pasture, maybe some bran mash to keep her comfortable. She be fine." But as Morrison's wagon disappeared down the track, Ruth found herself staring at the cattle with growing trepidation. They represented everything she had bet on this partnership: her home, her future, her ability to honor the debts that Thomas had left behind. The weight of responsibility felt heavier than all the fence posts she had carried. "Having second thoughts?" Dusty asked, echoing his question from the morning of the auction. "Third and fourth thoughts," Ruth replied, using the same words she had used then. But this time she straightened her shoulders and walked toward the barn. "But I suppose it's too late for second thoughts now." As they settled the cattle into their new pasture, Ruth realized that she had crossed another threshold in her partnership with Dusty. The man who had been a stranger 2 weeks ago was now someone she trusted with her livelihood, someone whose judgment she relied on more than her own when it came to the complexities of ranch management. The wedding ring on her finger, Thomas's ring, which she had worn faithfully since his death, suddenly felt loose and unfamiliar. Not because she had forgotten her husband or stopped loving his memory, but because she was no longer the same woman who had put it on. The partnership had changed her, forcing her to discover strengths she hadn't known she possessed, and to trust in ways she had never imagined possible. That night, as she prepared for bed, Ruth looked at herself in the mirror and saw a woman she barely recognized. Her hands were calloused, her face was tanned from hours in the sun, and her eyes held a confidence that had been missing since Thomas's death. The reflection looking back at her was someone who could handle cattle, negotiate with bankers, and trust her future to a partnership based on mutual respect rather than romantic love. Was a sobering realization, but not an unhappy one. For the first time in months, Ruth felt like she was moving forward instead of simply holding on. October arrived with a crispness that made the morning air sharp and clean, carrying the scent of turning leaves and the promise of winter's approach. The north pasture was now completely fenced, and the 30 head of cattle had settled into their new home with the contentment of animals well cared for. Ruth and Dusty had fallen into a comfortable working rhythm, their initial awkwardness replaced by the efficient coordination of partners who understood each other's strengths and limitations. But their success had not gone unnoticed in the community, and not all the attention was favorable. The first sign of trouble came when Ruth made her weekly trip to town for supplies. She had grown accustomed to the whispered conversations that stopped when she approached, the sideways glances and barely concealed speculation about her living arrangements. Most of it she could ignore, but the encounter at Morrison's General store tested her patience in ways she hadn't expected. "Ruth Kelton," said Mabel Hutchins, the banker's wife, in a voice that carried clearly across the store. "I hear you're making quite a success of your arrangement." Ruth set down the bag of flour she had been examining and turned to face the older woman. Mabel was flanked by two other ladies from the church auxiliary, their expressions ranging from disapproving to openly hostile. "If you mean the ranch, yes, we're making progress," Ruth replied evenly. "Progress," Mabel repeated, her voice dripping with innuendo. "Is that what you call it? A widow living alone with a strange man. No proper supervision, carrying on like married folks, without the benefit of marriage." Ruth felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Mr. Rowan lives in the barn loft, Mrs. Hutchins. Our arrangement is purely business, as anyone with eyes can see." "Business," sniffed one of the other women. "Thomas Kelton would be spinning in his grave if he knew what his wife was up to with that drifter." The comment hit Ruth like a physical blow, but before she could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "Ladies," said Dr. Elizabeth Fairchild, the town's physician and one of the few unmarried professional women in the county, "I believe you're confusing speculation with fact. Mrs. Kelton's business arrangements are her own concern, and frankly, I find her resourcefulness admirable." Dr. Fairchild was a formidable woman in her 50s who had earned the grudging respect of the community through her medical skills and her complete indifference to social conventions. Her support was valuable, but it also aligned Ruth with the town's other unconventional woman, which might do more harm than good, Dr. Fairchild. Mabel said stiffly, "Surely you can see the impropriety of the situation." "I can see a woman who found herself in desperate circumstances and had the courage to find an unconventional solution," Dr. Fairchild replied. "I can also see that her cattle are thriving, her fences are in good repair, and she's meeting her financial obligations. What more could anyone ask?" The exchange continued for several more uncomfortable minutes before Ruth excused herself and completed her shopping. But the incident left her shaken in ways she hadn't expected. She had known there would be gossip, but she hadn't fully considered how the community's disapproval might affect her business relationships, or her standing in the social structures that governed small-town life. When she returned to the ranch, she found Dusty examining his worn saddle with the careful attention of someone assessing a valued possession. The leather was cracked in places, and the stirrups showed signs of hard use, but it was clearly a quality piece that had been well maintained over the years. "Thinking of replacing it?" Ruth asked, grateful for the distraction from her troubled thoughts. "Just checking the rigging," Dusty replied, running his hands over the saddle's frame. "This old friend has carried me through a lot of country, but nothing lasts forever." Ruth found herself studying the saddle with new interest. It was the most personal possession Dusty owned, bearing the wear patterns of countless miles and the small modifications that marked it as uniquely his. A coiled rope hung from the horn, and the saddlebags showed the careful repairs of someone who understood the value of good equipment. "How long have you had it?" she asked. "About 15 years, Dusty said, his voice taking on the reflective tone he used when discussing his past. "Bought it in San Antonio from a saddler who took pride in his craft. Cost me 3 months' wages, but it was worth every penny." Ruth could see the attachment in the way he handled the leather, the unconscious gentleness of someone caring for a trusted companion. It reminded her of the way Thomas had treated his favorite tools, with the respect born of shared experience and mutual dependence. "It served you well," she observed. "That it has," Dusty agreed. "Carried me through good times and bad. Never let me down." He paused, then looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Funny thing about being a drifter, you learn to value the things that stay with you." There was something in his tone that suggested he wasn't just talking about the saddle, but Ruth wasn't sure how to respond to the implied meaning. Their partnership had been built on practical necessity rather than emotional connection. But she was beginning to realize that the boundaries between business and personal were harder to maintain than she had anticipated. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of John Henderson, who rode up with the urgency of someone bearing important news. His face was grave as he dismounted, and Ruth felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. "Ruth, Dusty," Henderson said without preamble, "we need to talk. There's been some trouble in town." Ruth's heart sank as she remembered her encounter at the general store. What kind of trouble? "The kind that comes from small minds and big mouths," Henderson replied grimly. "Ezra Hutchins has been talking to the county commissioners about your arrangement here. He's claiming that the partnership is a sham, that you're living in sin and using it as an excuse to avoid paying your debts." Dusty's face darkened with anger. "That's a serious accusation." "It gets worse," Henderson continued. "He's got some of the church folks stirred up, claiming that the community shouldn't be supporting immoral behavior. There's talk of calling in the loan immediately, demanding full payment of the back taxes." Ruth felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Just when she had begun to believe that their plan might actually work, the prejudices and small-mindedness of her community threatened to destroy everything they had built. "What can we do?" she asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded, despite the turmoil in her chest. "Fight back," Henderson said firmly. "Morrison and I have been talking to the other ranchers, the ones who supported you at the auction. Most of them think Hutchins is out of line, but they're worried about getting caught up in a scandal themselves." Dusty had been listening with the careful attention of someone who had faced hostile communities before. "What's Hutchins's real motivation?" he asked. "This isn't just about moral outrage." Henderson nodded approvingly at the question. "Smart man. You're right. There's more to it. Word is that Hutchins has been quietly assembling investors who want to buy up distressed ranch land for development. Your success threatens their plans?" The revelation hit Ruth like a physical blow. Her struggles weren't just about debt and taxes. They were about powerful men who saw her land as an opportunity for profit. The partnership that had seemed like salvation was now a target for those who preferred weakness and failure to unconventional success. "So what do we do?" Ruth asked again, this time with steel in her voice. "We prove them wrong," Dusty said quietly. "We show the community that our partnership is exactly what we said. It was a legitimate business arrangement that benefits everyone involved." "How do we do that?" Henderson smiled for the first time since his arrival. "By succeeding so spectacularly that even Hutchins can't deny the results. Your cattle are thriving, your ranch is profitable, and you're meeting your obligations. The best response to gossip is success." But Ruth knew it wouldn't be that simple. Success in business was one thing. Overcoming social prejudice was another entirely. She had underestimated the power of community disapproval and the lengths to which threatened interests would go to protect themselves. That evening, as she and Dusty discussed their options over a simple supper, Ruth found herself confronting the reality of what their partnership had cost her. She had gained a working ranch and a chance at financial security, but she had lost the comfortable certainty of her place in the community. "Are you having regrets?" Dusty asked, echoing his familiar question, but with a deeper concern than before. Ruth considered the question seriously, weighing the gains against the losses. The ranch was thriving, the cattle were healthy, and for the first time since Thomas's death, she felt like she was building a future rather than just surviving. But the social isolation was harder to bear than she had expected, and the constant scrutiny of her personal life was wearing on her spirit. "No," she said finally. "Not regrets. But I'm beginning to understand the real price of unconventional choices." Dusty nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about that, too. Maybe it's time we considered making our arrangement more conventional." Ruth looked at him sharply, unsure of his meaning. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that if the community is determined to see scandal where none exists, Perhaps we should give them something else to talk about. Dusty's voice was careful, measured. A proper marriage would silence the gossips and strengthen our legal position. The proposal hung in the air between them like a challenge. Ruth felt her pulse quicken, not with romantic excitement, but with the complex emotions of someone being offered a solution that solved practical problems while creating entirely new ones. Marriage, she repeated, testing the word. A business marriage, Dusty clarified. Nothing more than legal recognition of the partnership we already have. It would protect both of us and secure the ranch's future. Ruth stared at him across the table, seeing not the romantic hero of a novel, but a practical man offering a practical solution to an increasingly complex problem. It was an offer that made perfect sense from a business perspective, and no sense at all from the perspective of her heart, which was still learning to function without Thomas's presence. "I need time to think," she said. "Of course," Dusty replied. "It's not a decision to be made lightly." But as Ruth lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the wind rattle the windows, she realized that time was one luxury she might not have. The forces arrayed against their partnership were growing stronger, and conventional solutions might be the only way to preserve the unconventional success they had built together. November brought the first hard frost, and with it the urgent need to prepare for winter. The cattle required additional shelter and feed. The barn needed reinforcement against the coming storms. And Ruth found herself working alongside Dusty, with an intensity that left little time for contemplating the marriage proposal that hung between them like an unresolved chord. Their days began before dawn and extended well past sunset, lit by kerosene lamps that cast long shadows across the barn as they worked to secure bales of hay and check the cattle for signs of cold stress. The physical demands of ranch work had transformed Ruth's body. Her shoulders were broader, her hands permanently stained with work, and her posture carried the confident bearing of someone who knew her own capabilities. It was during one of these evening work sessions that Ruth first became aware of how the nature of their partnership was shifting. They moved around each other with an unconscious coordination that spoke of deep familiarity, anticipating each other's needs and compensating for each other's limitations without discussion. When Dusty reached for a tool, Ruth was already handing it to him. When she struggled with a heavy bale, he was there to help without being asked. "We work well together," she observed one evening as they finished securing the barn against an approaching storm. "We do," Dusty agreed, his voice carrying a warmth that made Ruth's pulse quicken despite herself. "I've worked with a lot of partners over the years, but never with anyone who understood the rhythm of work the way you do." The compliment pleased her more than it should have, and Ruth found herself studying Dusty's face in the lamplight. The harsh lines that had marked him as a drifter were softening, replaced by the contentment of a man who had found his place. His shoulders were still broad and strong, but they no longer carried the tension of someone ready to move on at a moment's notice. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Elizabeth Fairchild, who rode up through the gathering dusk with the urgency of someone on a medical call. Ruth's first thought was that someone in town had been injured, but the doctor's expression suggested more complex concerns. "Dr. Fairchild," Ruth called, wiping her hands on her apron as she approached. "Is everything all right?" "That depends on your definition of all right," the doctor replied grimly. "I've come to warn you about what's being planned in town." Ruth felt her stomach tighten with familiar dread. The brief respite from community pressure had apparently ended. "What kind of plans?" Dusty asked, joining them with the wariness of someone who had learned to expect trouble. Dr. Fairchild dismounted and accepted Ruth's invitation to come inside for coffee. As they settled around the kitchen table, she laid out the situation with the directness that characterized all her dealings. "Ezra Hutchins has convinced the church board to bring formal charges of moral turpitude against you. Ruth, They're claiming that your living arrangement with Mr. Rowan violates community standards and that your membership in the church should be revoked. Ruth felt the blood drain from her face. Church membership wasn't just a spiritual matter. It was the foundation of social acceptance in their community. Without it, she would be effectively ostracized, making it impossible to conduct business or maintain relationships with her neighbors. On what grounds? She asked, though she already knew the answer. On the grounds that an unmarried man and woman living on the same property, working together daily, and conducting business as partners creates an occasion for sin. Dr. Fairchild replied with obvious distaste for the phrase. It's Victorian nonsense, but it carries legal weight in matters of business licensing and property ownership. Dusty's face had darkened with anger. What they're really saying is that a woman can't be trusted to make her own decisions about her life and livelihood. Exactly, Dr. Fairchild agreed. But that doesn't make their actions any less dangerous to your position here. Ruth found herself thinking of the handwritten ranch ledger that documented their success. Page after page of careful records showing profitable operations, timely payments, and growing assets. None of that would matter if the community decided to make her a pariah. What are our options? She asked Dr. Fairchild, hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with what she was about to suggest. The most obvious solution would be marriage. A legal union would silence the gossips and protect your business interests. Ruth glanced at Dusty, remembering his proposal from the previous week. His expression was carefully neutral, but she could see the tension in his jaw that suggested he was thinking the same thoughts. But marriage shouldn't be entered into lightly, Dr. Fairchild continued, especially a marriage of convenience. There are other considerations, emotional, practical, and legal, that need to be weighed carefully. What other options do we have? Dusty asked. You could dissolve the partnership, Dr. Fairchild said reluctantly. Mr. Rowan could move on, and Mrs. Kelton could hire a conventional foreman with proper living arrangements. The suggestion hung in the air, like a death sentence. Ruth realized with startling clarity that losing Dusty would mean losing not just a business partner, but a friend whose presence had become essential to her daily happiness. The ranch would survive, but the satisfaction she had found in their shared work would disappear. That's not acceptable, Ruth said firmly, surprising herself with the speed and certainty of her response. Dusty looked at her with an expression that might have been relief. Then we're back to the marriage option. Ruth studied his face, trying to read the emotions behind his careful mask. Is that what you want, Dusty? A marriage of convenience to protect our business interests? I want what's best for both of us, he replied carefully. But I also want you to know that if we do this, it would be more than just a business arrangement for me. The admission hung between them, changing everything and nothing. Ruth felt her heart skip in a way it hadn't since Thomas's death, but she also felt the weight of responsibility that came with someone else's emotional investment. I need to understand what you mean by that, she said quietly. Dusty was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on his hands. When he spoke, his voice carried the vulnerability of someone risking rejection. I mean that somewhere in these months of working together, you stopped being just a business partner to me. I've come to care about your happiness, your future, your well-being in ways that go beyond our financial arrangement. He looked up to meet her eyes. I'm not asking you to love me the way you loved Thomas. I'm asking if you could learn to care for me the way I've learned to care for you. Ruth felt tears prick her eyes, moved by the honesty and humility of his confession. Looking at Dusty across her kitchen table, she saw not the desperate drifter who had appeared at her gate, but a man who had chosen to build his life around her happiness. It wasn't the passionate romance of her youth, but it was something deeper and more sustainable, a partnership of equals, who had chosen each other with full knowledge of each other's strengths and limitations. I already do care for you, Dusty, she said softly. More than I expected to, more than I thought I could after losing Thomas. Dr. Fairchild cleared her throat gently, reminding them of her presence. If you're seriously considering marriage, there are practical matters to discuss. The ceremony would need to be public enough to satisfy the community, but private enough to feel genuine to both of you. What do you suggest? Ruth asked. A simple ceremony at the church, with enough advance notice to prevent accusations of secrecy, but not enough time for opposition to organize. Perhaps in 2 weeks' time enough for proper bans, but not enough for extended gossip. Ruth looked at Dusty, seeing her own mixture of anticipation and uncertainty reflected in his eyes. 2 weeks. 2 weeks, he agreed. Long enough to be sure, short enough to prevent interference. As Dr. Fairchild prepared to leave, she paused at the door with a final piece of advice. Marriage changes everything, even when it begins as a practical arrangement. Be prepared for that. After she left, Ruth and Dusty sat in comfortable silence, each lost in contemplation of the future they were choosing together. The storm that had been building all evening finally broke, sending rain against the windows and sheets that reminded Ruth of the leaky roof that had brought them together. "Are you sure about this?" Dusty asked eventually. Ruth looked around the kitchen that would soon be their kitchen, at the ranch that would soon be their ranch, at the life they had built together through hard work and mutual respect. It wasn't the future she had planned, but it was a future she could embrace with confidence and hope. "I'm sure," she said, and meant it. The wedding was planned for the following Sunday, and Ruth spent the week in a whirlwind of practical preparations that left little time for emotional introspection. There were legal documents to prepare, arrangements to make with the minister, and the delicate task of informing their supporters in the community, while avoiding those who might try to interfere. It was while searching through Thomas's papers for the original property deed that Ruth made the discovery that would change everything. She had been looking for the documents in Thomas's old desk, a massive oak piece that had belonged to his father, when she found a hidden compartment behind one of the drawers. Inside were papers she had never seen before, correspondence with railroad surveyors, maps showing proposed routes, and most shocking of all, a formal option agreement giving the Nebraska Central Railroad the right to purchase a corridor through their property. Ruth stared at the papers with growing amazement and confusion. According to the documents, the railroad had been planning a spur line through their valley for over 2 years, and Thomas had negotiated an option that would have made them wealthy beyond their dreams. The payment for the land corridor alone would have been enough to pay off all their debts and leave them with a substantial fortune. But the option had expired 6 months after Thomas's death, and Ruth had never known of its existence. "Dusty," she called, her voice shaking with excitement and bewilderment. "You need to see this." He came in from the barn, took one look at her face, and sat down without being asked. Ruth spread the papers across the kitchen table, explaining what she had found and what it meant. "Why wouldn't Thomas have told me about this?" she asked, studying a map that showed the proposed railroad route running directly through their north pasture, the same pasture they had just finished fencing for cattle. Dusty examined the documents with the careful attention of someone who understood legal language. Maybe he was waiting for the right time, or maybe he was protecting you from disappointment if the deal fell through. But it didn't fall through, Ruth said, holding up a letter from the railroad company. They were ready to proceed. The option was valid until 6 months after his death, but I never knew to exercise it. The implications were staggering. If Ruth had known about the railroad option, she never would have faced foreclosure. The ranch would have been saved, the debts would have been paid, and she never would have needed to enter into partnership with Dusty. "There's more," Dusty said quietly, studying another document. "Look at this survey map. The railroad didn't just want a corridor through your property. They wanted to establish a depot here. This valley was going to be a major stop on their western expansion." Ruth felt dizzy with the magnitude of what she was learning. A depot would mean a town, businesses, homes, commerce. Our little ranch would have been at the center of a growing community. Would have been, Dusty repeated. But the option expired. The railroad moved on to other routes. Ruth sank into her chair, overwhelmed by the revelation. All of this, the foreclosure, the partnership, the community opposition, none of it would have been necessary if I had just known about these papers. Dusty was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with an expression she couldn't read. Are you saying you regret the choices we made? The question caught Ruth off guard. She looked at Dusty, at the man who had worked beside her, supported her, and chosen to build his future around hers, and realized that the answer was more complicated than she had expected. I don't know, she said honestly. Everything would have been different. I would have been wealthy, secure, independent. I wouldn't have needed to make compromises or face the community's disapproval. And you wouldn't have needed me, Dusty said quietly. The words hung between them like a challenge. Ruth realized that this was the heart of the matter, not just what she had lost by not knowing about the railroad option, but what she might have missed by not needing to take desperate chances. Before she could respond, they heard the sound of approaching horses. Looking out the window, Ruth saw a group of men riding up the track, but these weren't neighbors or local officials. They wore the clothes of professional men from the city, and their bearing suggested official business. Dusty went to meet them while Ruth hurriedly gathered the railroad documents. Her instincts told her to keep the papers hidden until she understood what these strangers wanted. The leader of the group was a well-dressed man in his 50s who introduced himself as James Morrison, no relation to their neighbor Samuel, a representative of the Nebraska Central Railroad. With him were a surveyor, a legal clerk, and another man whose purpose wasn't immediately clear. Mrs. Kelton, Morrison said, removing his hat with old-fashioned courtesy. I apologize for arriving unannounced, but we've recently become aware that there may have been a misunderstanding regarding certain property rights in this area. Ruth felt her pulse quicken. What kind of misunderstanding? Morrison glanced at his companions before responding. Our records show that your late husband held an option agreement for railroad access through this property. We assumed the option had been declined when we didn't hear from you after his death, but recent review of our files suggests there may have been communication issues. Ruth's mind raced. These men didn't know that she had just discovered the papers. They were here because something had prompted them to revisit the abandoned option. Communication issues? She asked carefully. It appears that notices regarding the option may not have reached you properly, Morrison explained. Our correspondence was addressed to your husband, and after his death, it's possible that important documents were mislaid or overlooked. Surveyor spoke up. We've been exploring alternative routes for the past year, but this valley remains our preferred choice for the western spur. The grades are ideal, and the depot location would serve the entire region effectively. Ruth felt Dusty's presence beside her, solid and reassuring, but she also felt the weight of decision pressing down on her. These men were offering her the chance to reclaim the fortune that should have been hers, but at what cost? What exactly are you proposing? She asked. Morrison smiled, clearly pleased by her interest. A renewed option agreement with improved terms that reflect the increased value of railroad access. We're prepared to offer 50% more than the original agreement, plus additional compensation for depot rights. The legal clerk opened his satchel and produced a document thick with official seals and legal language. The new offer would pay enough to make you one of the wealthiest landowners in the territory, Mrs. Kelton. More than enough to secure your future and establish yourself as a woman of independent means. Ruth stared at the contract, seeing numbers that represented security beyond anything she had ever imagined. But she also saw the end of the life she had been building with Dusty, the partnership that had given her strength, the shared work that had given her purpose, and the relationship that had taught her to trust in unexpected possibilities. I need time to consider this, she said finally. Of course, Morrison replied. But I should mention that we're working under certain time constraints. The Railroad Board meets next month to finalize the western expansion route. If we're going to proceed with this valley, we need a commitment within the next 2 weeks. 2 weeks, the same amount of time until our planned wedding to Dusty. After the railroad men left, Ruth and Dusty sat in the kitchen surrounded by documents that represented 2 completely different futures. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions and uncertain possibilities. What are you thinking? Dusty asked finally. Ruth looked at him, really looked, seeing not just the man who had saved her roof and her ranch, but the person who had become essential to her daily happiness. I'm thinking that life has a strange sense of timing. It does indeed, Dusty agreed. The question is, what do you want to do about it? Ruth spread the railroad contract next to their partnership agreement, studying the stark differences between them. One offered wealth and independence. The other offered partnership and shared purpose. One represented the life she could have had. The other represented the life she had chosen. I know what the practical choice would be, she said slowly. Accept the railroad offer, become wealthy, live as an independent woman of means. But, Dusty prompted. But I'm not sure that's the life I want anymore, Ruth admitted. These past months working with you, building something together, I've discovered parts of myself I never knew existed. I'm not the same woman who would have been content with comfort and security. Dusty reached across the table and took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. Whatever you decide, I'll support it. If you want to take the railroad money and start a new life, I'll understand. Ruth squeezed his hand, feeling the strength and steadiness that had anchored her through the most challenging months of her life. And if I choose to honor our partnership, our plans for marriage, then we'll build something even better than what either of us could have imagined alone, Dusty said without hesitation. Ruth looked around the kitchen that had become the center of their shared life, at the ranch that had tested and strengthened them both, at the future that spread before them like an uncharted territory full of possibility. The choice before her wasn't really between wealth and poverty, or even between independence and partnership. It was between the safety of the known and the adventure of the unknown, between the life she could have had and the life she was actively creating. For the first time since discovering the hidden papers, Ruth smiled. Then I guess we have a wedding to plan. The week leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of activity that left Ruth feeling both exhilarated and overwhelmed. Word of the impending ceremony had spread through the community with the speed of prairie fire, generating reactions that ranged from enthusiastic support to shocked disapproval. But underneath the social turbulence, a more complex drama was unfolding as the various forces that had shaped Ruth's crisis began to converge. The first surprise came on Tuesday morning when Samuel Morrison arrived with news that would change everything they thought they knew about their situation. Ruth, Dusty, he said, dismounting with the urgency of someone carrying momentous information. I've just come from a meeting with the railroad representatives. Ruth felt her stomach clench. She and Dusty had decided to decline the railroad offer, but they hadn't yet informed the company of their decision. She hoped Morrison wasn't here to pressure them into reconsidering. What kind of meeting? Dusty asked, his tone carefully neutral. Morrison's face was grim. The kind where you learn that nothing is quite what it seemed. It turns out that James Morrison, the railroad man, isn't just any representative. He's Ezra Hutchins's brother-in-law, and this whole railroad option business is more complicated than anyone realized. Ruth felt the blood drain from her face. What do you mean? I mean that Hutchins has been working with the railroad from the beginning, trying to assemble a package of properties for their western expansion. Your ranch was always the key piece. But when Thomas died, and you started facing financial difficulties, Hutchins saw an opportunity to acquire your land cheaply and then sell it to the railroad at a massive profit. The revelation hit Ruth like A physical blow. The foreclosure, the community pressure, the moral outrage about her partnership with Dusty, all of it had been orchestrated by Hutchins as part of a larger scheme to steal her property. That's why he was so determined to force the auction, Dusty said, understanding flooding his voice. He needed you to lose the ranch so he could buy it and flip it to the railroad. Morrison nodded grimly. But your partnership threw a wrench in his plans. When you started making the ranch profitable and paying your debts, he realized he needed a different approach. The moral crusade against your living arrangements was his way of trying to force you out. Ruth sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the scope of the deception. So the railroad offer we received, was that legitimate? Completely legitimate, Morrison confirmed. The railroad genuinely wants your property, and they're willing to pay top dollar for it. What they don't know is that Hutchins has been positioning himself as their local agent, taking a substantial commission on any properties he helps them acquire. But if we accept the railroad offer directly, Hutchins gets nothing, Dusty said, following the logic to its conclusion. Exactly. Which is why he's been so desperate to discredit your partnership and force you into a position where you'd have to sell to him instead. Ruth stood up abruptly, pacing to the window as she processed. The implications. Everything that had happened, every crisis, every pressure, every moment of doubt, had been manufactured by a man who saw her tragedy as his opportunity. There's more, Morrison continued. The community petition supporting your partnership. It's got more signatures than Hutchins realizes. People are beginning to understand what he's been up to, and they don't like being manipulated. Ruth turned back to face the two men, feeling a surge of determination that surprised her with its intensity. What exactly are you saying, Samuel? I'm saying that if you want to fight back, you've got support. Real support from people who believe in what you and Dusty have built here. The next few days brought a steady stream of visitors to the ranch, each carrying pieces of information that helped complete the picture of Hutchins's scheme. Dr. Elizabeth Fairchild arrived with legal documents showing that Hutchins had been quietly buying up distressed properties throughout the county. John Henderson brought copies of correspondence between Hutchins and railroad officials that revealed the extent of his commission arrangement. Even Sheriff Millbrook stopped by, his official demeanor barely concealing his anger at having been used as an unwitting tool in Hutchins's plan. The man made fools of all of us, Millbrook said, his jaw tight with suppressed rage. Used my office to legitimize his harassment. Used the law to steal from a widow. It's not right, and it's not legal. But the most significant development came on Friday evening, when Dr. Fairchild returned with a document that would shift the balance of power decisively in Ruth's favor. It's a community petition, she explained, unrolling a paper covered with signatures. Every person who signed is formally requesting that the county commissioners investigate Hutchins's business practices and consider revoking his banking license. Ruth studied the names, recognizing neighbors, customers, fellow church members, people from every level of their small community who had decided to take a stand against corruption and manipulation. How many signatures? Dusty asked. Over 200, Dr. Fairchild replied with satisfaction, including several county commissioners and 3 members of the church board. Hutchins has overplayed his hand, and people are finally seeing him for what he really is. Ruth felt a surge of emotion that was part gratitude, part vindication, and part something she couldn't quite name. These people, her neighbors, her community, had chosen to stand with her against a powerful man who had seemed untouchable just weeks before. What happens now? She asked. Now we present this petition at your wedding ceremony, Dr. Fairchild said with a slight smile. Let Hutchins and his supporters see exactly how isolated they've become. The wedding preparations took on new significance as Ruth and Dusty realized that their ceremony would be more than just a personal commitment. It would be a public declaration of the community's values and a repudiation of those who had tried to manipulate them. Ruth spent Saturday evening preparing her wedding dress, not the elaborate gown of a young bride, but a simple blue dress that reflected her practical nature and mature perspective. As she worked, she found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a desperate widow, facing the loss of everything she held dear. Now she was a successful ranch owner, about to marry a man she respected and cared for, surrounded by a community that had chosen to support her unconventional choices. Dusty spent the evening in the barn, grooming his horse and caring for his equipment with the methodical attention he gave to all important tasks. His wedding clothes were laid out in his small room above the barn, a good suit that had seen better days, but was clean and carefully mended. Like Ruth, he was reflecting on the path that had led him here, from drifting cowboy to respected rancher to soon-to-be husband of a remarkable woman. As Sunday morning dawned clear and cold, Ruth stood at her bedroom window, looking out over the ranch that had become the center of her new life. The cattle were healthy, the fences were strong, the buildings were sound. Everything spoke of success achieved through hard work and partnership. In a few hours, she would walk into the church as Mrs. Thomas Kelton's widow and walk out as Mrs. Jack Rowan's wife, not because she had to, but because she had chosen to. The church was fuller than it had been for any service in recent memory. Word of the petition and the Hutchins scandal had spread throughout the county, drawing people who wanted to witness what many saw as a test of their community's character. Ruth was surprised to see faces she didn't recognize: ranchers from neighboring counties, business people from the county seat, even a few railroad officials who had apparently come to assess the situation for themselves. As Ruth walked down the aisle in her simple blue dress, carrying a bouquet of late-season wildflowers that Dusty had picked for her that morning, she felt the weight of history settling around her. This ceremony wasn't just about two people choosing each other. It was about a community choosing its values and a woman claiming her right to define her own future. Dusty waited at the altar in his carefully pressed suit, his weathered hands steady and his eyes warm with genuine affection. Beside him stood Samuel Morrison as best man, while Dr. Fairchild served as Ruth's matron of honor, an arrangement that would have scandalized the community just months before, but now seemed perfectly appropriate. As they took their vows, speaking words of partnership and mutual respect rather than passionate romance, Ruth felt a deep sense of rightness about the choice she was making. This wasn't the marriage she had dreamed of as a young woman, but it was the marriage she needed as a mature woman who had learned to value substance over sentiment. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the applause that erupted from the congregation was more than polite acknowledgement. It was genuine celebration from a community that had found its way back to its better angels. But even as Ruth and Dusty shared their first kiss as husband and wife, both knew that the real test of their union lay ahead. Hutchins hadn't been present at the ceremony, but his allies were scattered throughout the congregation, their faces showing varying degrees of anger and calculation. The petition might have shifted public opinion, but it hadn't eliminated the threat he represented. As the congregation filed out of the church, Dr. Fairchild approached with the community petition in hand. "Are you ready to present this?" she asked quietly. Ruth looked at Dusty, seeing her own determination reflected in his eyes. "We're ready," she said. The presentation took place on the church steps, with most of the wedding guests serving as witnesses. Dr. Fairchild read the petition aloud, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. As she spoke, Ruth watched the faces of those who had supported Hutchins, seeing uncertainty replace confidence as the scope of community opposition became clear. Sheriff Millbrook stepped forward to formally accept the petition on behalf of the county commissioners. "This matter will be investigated thoroughly," he announced. "The people of this county deserve honest dealing from their financial institutions." It was then that Ezra Hutchins finally made his appearance, arriving in a carriage with several well-dressed men whom Ruth didn't recognize. His face was flushed with anger, and his usually immaculate appearance showed signs of the strain he'd been under. "This is an outrage," he called out, pushing through the crowd toward the church steps. "A coordinated attack on a respected businessman by malcontents and troublemakers." "Mr. Hutchins," Sheriff Millbrook said formally, "you'll have an opportunity to respond to these allegations through proper channels. This is neither the time nor the place for such discussions." But Hutchins was beyond listening to reason. Pointing directly at Ruth and Dusty, he launched into a tirade that revealed more about his true character than any investigation could have done. "This woman has made a mockery of everything decent and proper," he shouted. "Living in sin with a drifter, flaunting convention, and now hiding behind a sham marriage to avoid the consequences of her debts." The crowd stirred uneasily, but instead of the support Hutchins had expected, he found himself facing hostile stares and angry murmurs. His words were having the opposite of their intended effect, confirming rather than dispelling the impression that he was a man consumed by spite. And greed. Samuel Morrison stepped forward, his voice calm but carrying clearly across the crowd. "Mr. Hutchins, are you suggesting that Mrs. Rowan's marriage is illegitimate?" "I'm suggesting that this entire charade is designed to defraud honest creditors and manipulate public sympathy," Hutchins replied, his voice rising dangerously. It was Dr. Fairchild who delivered the blow that would end Hutchins's influence once and for all. "Mr. Hutchins," she said with icy precision, "are you speaking as a concerned citizen, or as someone who stands to profit from Mrs. Rowan's misfortune?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Hutchins's face went white, then red, as he realized that his scheme had been exposed more thoroughly than he had understood. "Furthermore," Dr. Fairchild continued, "perhaps you could explain to this assembled community why your brother-in-law approached Mrs. Rowan with a railroad offer just days before her wedding, and why that offer coincidentally matched the amount of her outstanding debts." The crowd's murmur grew louder as people began to grasp the full scope of what had been happening. Hutchins looked around wildly, seeing suspicion and anger where he had expected to find support. "This is a conspiracy," he said desperately. "A coordinated attack by people who want to see traditional values destroyed." "No, Mr. Hutchins," Ruth said, speaking publicly for the first time since the confrontation began. Her voice was steady, dignified, and carried the authority of someone who had earned her position through honest effort. "This is a community defending itself against someone who would exploit tragedy for personal gain." She stepped forward, Dusty, at her side, presenting a united front that embodied everything their partnership had come to represent. "You tried to steal my home, manipulate my neighbors, and destroy my reputation because you saw profit in my husband's death. But you underestimated both me and this community." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of Hutchins's carriage as he and his companions beat a hasty retreat. When they were gone, the crowd erupted in applause that was part celebration, part relief, and part recognition that they had witnessed something significant. As Ruth and Dusty stood on the church steps, surrounded by neighbors who had chosen to support them against powerful opposition, they both understood that their marriage had become something larger than a personal commitment. It was a symbol of the community's ability to recognize and reward genuine worth over social pretension, honest effort over inherited privilege. The wedding reception that followed was held in the church hall, with food contributed by dozens of families and an atmosphere of genuine celebration that lasted well into the evening. But for Ruth and Dusty, the real celebration would come later, when they returned to their ranch as husband and wife, ready to build a future based on mutual respect, shared work, and the knowledge that they had earned their happiness through courage, determination, and faith in each other. The weeks following the wedding brought both triumph and new challenges as Ruth and Dusty settled into married life while dealing with the aftermath of their very public confrontation with Hutchins. The banker's influence in the community had crumbled overnight. But his connections to outside interests meant that their troubles were far from over. The first sign of continued conflict came in the form of a legal notice, delivered by a stern-faced attorney from the county seat. Ruth and Dusty were sitting at their kitchen table, reviewing the ranch's financial records when Sheriff Millbrook arrived with the unwelcome document. "I'm sorry to bring this to you folks," Millbrook said, his expression apologetic. "But Hutchins has filed a formal challenge to your marriage, claiming fraud and requesting an injunction against any further business transactions until the matter is resolved." Ruth felt her stomach drop as she read the legal language. "He's claiming our marriage is invalid. He's claiming it was entered into solely to avoid debt obligations and that your partnership was designed to defraud creditors." Millbrook explained, "It's a desperate move, but it could tie up your assets for months while the courts sort it out." Dusty's face had darkened with anger, but his voice remained controlled. "What does this mean for the ranch operations?" "Technically, it means you can't sell cattle, take out loans, or make any major financial decisions until the court rules on the validity of your marriage," Millbrook said reluctantly. The implications were staggering. Their cattle were ready for market, and the profits from the sale were essential to making their next payment to the bank and their investor neighbors. Without the ability to conduct normal business, they could lose everything they had worked so hard to build. How long could this process take? Ruth asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Months, possibly longer if Hutchins drags it through appeals," Millbrook replied. "I'm sorry, Ruth. This isn't justice, it's harassment using the legal system as a weapon." After the sheriff left, Ruth and Dusty sat in stunned silence, grappling with the reality that their victory at the church had been only the beginning of their fight. Hutchins might have lost the support of the community, but he still had the resources and connections to wage legal warfare against them. It was Dusty who broke the silence, pulling a small object from his vest pocket. Ruth recognized it immediately as a pocket watch, the kind carried by men of previous generations, worn smooth by years of handling. "This was my father's," Dusty said quietly, holding the watch with obvious reverence. "The only thing of value. He left me when he died. I've carried it for 20 years, through good times and bad, keeping it as a reminder of where I came from." Ruth looked at the watch, understanding without being told that Dusty was sharing something deeply personal. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "My father was a good man who believed in doing right by people," Dusty continued. "He taught me that sometimes you have to risk everything you have to protect what matters most." He looked up at Ruth, his eyes reflecting both determination and vulnerability. "I think he'd understand what I'm about to propose. What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking we fight fire with fire," Dusty said, his voice growing stronger. "Hutchins is using his outside connections against us, but we have something he doesn't: the genuine support of people who know us and trust us." Ruth leaned forward, intrigued despite her anxiety. "Go on. What if we bypass the legal system entirely? What if we take our case directly to the railroad and offer them a deal they can't refuse?" Ruth stared at him, beginning to understand the audacious plan forming in his mind. "You're suggesting we sell to the railroad ourselves?" "I'm suggesting we negotiate with them as equal partners, not as desperate sellers. We tell them about Hutchins's scheme, show them that we're legitimate business people with community support, and offer them something better than what Hutchins could provide." The idea was risky beyond measure. If they guessed wrong about the railroad's reaction, or if Hutchins had more influence with the company than they realized, they could lose everything. But Ruth found herself energized by the possibility of taking control of their situation, rather than simply reacting to Hutchins's attacks. "What makes you think the railroad would listen to us instead of Hutchins?" Dusty smiled grimly. "Because railroad companies care about one thing above all else: profitable operations. Hutchins is offering them a middleman who takes a commission and might face criminal charges. We're offering them direct dealing with the actual property owners who have community support and a proven track record of successful ranch management. Ruth pulled out the original railroad correspondence they had discovered, studying the terms and conditions with new eyes. If we could negotiate a better deal, one that lets us keep part of the ranch while selling the railroad corridor, we could have the best of both worlds. Exactly. We keep our home and our cattle operation. They get their railroad access, and Hutchins gets nothing. The plan was ambitious and fraught with risk, but Ruth realized it offered something that simply defending against Hutchins's legal attacks could not. The possibility of victory rather than mere survival. When would we approach them? She asked. Tomorrow, Dusty said firmly. Before Hutchins realizes what we're planning, and before the legal injunction can complicate matters further. Ruth looked at her husband, still strange to think of him that way, and saw the same determined courage that had impressed her from their first meeting. This was a man who would risk everything to protect what they had built together, and she found herself matching his resolve with her own. All right, she said. But if we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. We need documentation, references, and a presentation that shows we're serious business people, not desperate farmers. They spent the evening preparing for what would either be the salvation of their ranch or the final gamble that would cost them everything. Ruth compiled their financial records, showing the ranch's profitability and their timely payments to creditors. Dusty drafted a proposal that outlined the benefits of direct negotiation and highlighted the community support they enjoyed. As midnight approached, they sat at their kitchen table surrounded by papers that represented their entire future. Pocket watch lay open beside Dusty's elbow, its steady ticking marking the passage of time toward what would be the most important day of their partnership. Are you ready for this? Ruth asked, echoing the question that had become their ritual before major decisions. Dusty closed the pocket watch and slipped it back into his vest. I'm ready, he said. Win or lose, we'll face it together. Ruth reached across the table and took his hand, feeling the calluses that marked their shared work and the strength that had anchored her through the most challenging months of her life. Tomorrow they would risk everything on a single desperate gamble, but tonight they were simply two people who had chosen each other and were prepared to fight for the life they had built together. The meeting with the railroad officials took place in the Grand Hotel in the county seat, an imposing brick building that reminded Ruth of just how small and rural her world had been until recent months. She and Dusty arrived precisely on time, dressed in their best clothes and carrying a leather portfolio containing their carefully prepared presentation. James Morrison, the railroad representative who had visited their ranch weeks earlier, greeted them in the hotel's lobby with surprise that gradually shifted to curiosity as he realized they had requested this meeting rather than simply responding to his company's overtures. Mr. and Mrs. Rowan, he said, the new title still sounding strange to Ruth's ears. I must admit, I wasn't expecting to hear from you again so soon. I understood you had declined our offer. Circumstances have changed, Dusty replied diplomatically. We'd like to discuss a modified arrangement that might better serve everyone's interests. Morrison led them to a private dining room where two other railroad officials waited, Charles Pemberton, the regional development director, and William Hayes, the company's chief surveyor. Ruth recognized Hayes from the group that had visited their ranch, but Pemberton was new, a sharp-eyed man in his 40s, whose expensive clothes and confident bearing marked him as someone accustomed to making important decisions. Ladies and gentlemen, Morrison began as they settled around the polished mahogany table. Mr. and Mrs. Rowan have requested this meeting to discuss alternative arrangements for railroad access through their property. Pemberton leaned back in his chair, studying Ruth and Dusty with undisguised interest. I understand there have been some complications regarding your property rights and business arrangements. Ruth felt her pulse quicken realizing that the railroad officials were already aware of Hutchins's legal challenge. "What kind of complications?" she asked carefully. "Oh, come now, Mrs. Rowan," Pemberton said with a slight smile. "We're businessmen, not country folk impressed by local gossip. We're aware that certain parties have been positioning themselves as intermediaries for property transactions in this region, and we're also aware that your recent marriage has been challenged in court." Dusty leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying the calm authority Ruth had learned to recognize. "Then you understand why direct negotiation might be preferable to working through intermediaries with questionable motives." "Indeed," Pemberton replied. "The question is, what are you proposing that would be superior to existing arrangements?" Ruth opened their portfolio and spread out the documents they had prepared. "We're proposing a partnership that benefits both parties while eliminating the complications and commissions associated with third-party involvement." She outlined their proposal with the confidence she had developed through months of managing ranch business. Instead of selling the entire property, they would grant the railroad permanent easement rights for the corridor and depot, while retaining ownership of the remaining land for continued ranching operations. The arrangement would provide the railroad with everything they needed while allowing Ruth and Dusty to maintain their livelihood and community ties. "Furthermore," Dusty added, "our proposal includes something that no intermediary could provide: ongoing local support and cooperation. We have strong relationships with neighboring ranchers who would welcome the economic opportunities that a railroad depot would bring." Hayes, the surveyor, studied the maps Ruth had provided. "The proposed corridor would actually be more efficient than our original plan," he admitted. "Retaining the ranching operation around the depot would provide immediate freight opportunities and local business." But Pemberton was more skeptical. "Your proposal has merit," he said carefully, "but it doesn't address the legal complications. If your marriage is ruled invalid and your business partnership is dissolved, we could find ourselves dealing with a very different situation." Ruth felt her heart sink, but Dusty was ready with a response that surprised her with its boldness. "Mr. Pemberton," he said, reaching into his vest pocket, "let me show you something that might put those concerns in perspective." He pulled out his father's pocket watch and placed it on the table between them. The simple gesture seemed incongruous in the elegant hotel dining room, but it commanded attention in ways that more dramatic actions might not have. "This watch belonged to my father, who taught me that a man's worth isn't measured by his legal documents, but by his character and his commitments," Dusty said quietly. "Ruth and I entered into partnership because we saw the potential to build something worthwhile together. We married because we discovered that partnership had grown into something deeper and more lasting." He opened the watch, revealing an inscription inside the cover: "To James Rowan for 20 years of faithful service, 1855 to 1875. My father worked for the same employer for 20 years, Dusty continued, "not because he was legally bound to, but because he gave his word and kept it. Ruth and I are offering you the same thing, our word that will honor our commitments regardless of what legal challenges we might face." Pemberton studied the watch with obvious interest. "You're asking us to base a significant business decision on personal character rather than legal guarantees." "I'm asking you to recognize that the best business relationships are built on mutual trust and shared interests," Dusty replied. "You need reliable partners who will support your railroad operations for decades to come. We need a way to secure our future while maintaining our home and livelihood. Legal documents are important, but they can't create the foundation of trust that makes partnerships successful." Ruth watched the railroad officials exchange glances, recognizing the moment when their proposal would either be accepted or rejected. Everything they had worked for, their marriage, their ranch, their future hung in the balance of these men's decision. It was Morrison who broke the silence. "Mrs. Rowan, may I ask you a direct question?" "Of course." "If we were to accept your proposal, and if the legal challenges to your marriage were to succeed, what would happen to our agreement?" Ruth looked at Dusty, seeing her own determination reflected in his eyes. "Mr. Morrison, my partnership with my husband began before our marriage and will continue regardless of what any court might say about the validity of our union. We've built something together that's bigger than legal definitions or social conventions." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "If you want partners who will stand by their commitments through good times and bad, who understand the value of long-term relationships over short-term profits, then we're the people you're looking for. If you want intermediaries who take commissions and disappear when complications arise, then perhaps you should continue working with Mr. Hutchins." Pemberton smiled for the first time since the meeting began. "Mrs. Rowan, that's the most persuasive argument I've heard in months of negotiations." He turned to his colleagues, and Ruth saw the subtle nods that indicated agreement. "Gentlemen, I believe we have the foundation for a mutually beneficial arrangement." The details took another 2 hours to negotiate, but the framework was established. Ruth and Dusty would retain ownership of their ranch while granting the railroad permanent easement rights and depot privileges. The compensation would be enough to pay off all their debts while providing capital for expanding their cattle operations. Most importantly, the agreement would be structured as a business partnership that would remain valid, regardless of any challenges to their marriage. As they prepared to leave the hotel, Pemberton shook hands with both Ruth and Dusty. "You've given us something we weren't expecting," he said. "Partners we can trust to keep their word." Dusty slipped his father's watch back into his vest pocket. "Trust works both ways, Mr. Pemberton. We're counting on you to honor your commitments." As well, the ride back to their ranch passed in relative silence, both Ruth and Dusty absorbing the magnitude of what they had accomplished. They had not only secured their future, but had done so on their own terms, without compromising their principles or betraying their values. As their ranch came into view, the repaired barn, the strong fences, the healthy cattle, Ruth realized that she was looking at more than just a successful business operation. She was looking at the physical manifestation of what two people could accomplish when they chose to trust each other completely and work toward shared goals. "We did it," she said quietly. "We did indeed," Dusty replied, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had risked everything and won. That evening, as they sat on their front porch, watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, Ruth reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. What had begun with a simple trade roof repair for a meal had become a partnership that had withstood legal challenges, social pressure, and financial crisis. The new ranch sign that Dusty had crafted that afternoon leaned against the porch railing, waiting to be installed the next morning. It read simply, "Rowan Ranch Est, 1888, marking not just their ownership, but their transformation from desperate individuals into a successful partnership. Spring arrived early the following year, bringing with it the sounds of construction as the railroad crew began work on the spur line that would transform their quiet valley into a hub of commerce and activity. Ruth stood on her front porch, watching the organized chaos of progress while sipping her morning coffee, a ritual that had become even more precious since the hectic months of the previous year. The legal challenges to their marriage had been quietly dropped after Hutchins's banking license was revoked, and he left the county under a cloud of scandal. The community that had once whispered about Ruth's unconventional choices now pointed to the Rowan Ranch as an example of what could be accomplished through determination and hard work. Their cattle operation had expanded to include breeding contracts with ranchers throughout the territory, and the depot under construction would provide new markets for their livestock. But the true measure of their success wasn't reflected in financial records or community standing. It was visible in the comfortable partnership that Ruth and Dusty had forged through their trials. They moved through their daily routines with the easy coordination of people who understood each other completely. Their relationship deepened by shared challenges and mutual respect. "The depot platform is starting to take shape," Dusty observed. joining Ruth on the porch with his own cup of coffee. The morning routine of planning their day had become one of Ruth's favorite parts of ranch life. "Hard to believe this time last year we were worried about fixing a leaky roof," Ruth replied, watching a crew of workers position timber frames with practiced efficiency. Dusty chuckled, his hand unconsciously touching the pocket where he still carried his father's watch. "That leaky roof was the best thing that ever happened to me." Ruth looked at him with the affectionate exasperation that had become characteristic of their interactions. "You might change your mind when the depot brings dozens of strangers through our valley every week. Progress has its complications," Dusty agreed, "but it also has its opportunities. Dr. Fairchild is talking about opening a second medical practice here once the railroad is operational. John Henderson is planning to expand his farming operation to supply grain to the depot. Even Samuel Morrison is considering starting a freight business." The transformation of their community was indeed remarkable. What had been a quiet agricultural valley was becoming a center of commerce that would serve ranchers and farmers throughout the region. The railroad had brought more than just transportation. It had brought hope and opportunity to people who had struggled with isolation and limited markets. "There's something I've been meaning to discuss with you," Ruth said, settling into the chair beside Dusty's. "I received a letter yesterday from the Women's Suffrage Association in Lincoln. They've heard about our partnership and want me to speak at their annual convention." Dusty raised an eyebrow with interest. "What would you talk about?" "About what we've built here. About the importance of women having the legal right to enter into business partnerships and make their own financial decisions." Ruth paused, considering her words carefully. "About how unconventional arrangements can sometimes be the most practical solutions to difficult problems. And what did you tell them?" Ruth smiled, remembering her own surprise at the invitation. "I told them I'd consider it, but only if they understood that I'm not a political radical. I'm just a ranch wife who learned that sometimes you have to make your own opportunities." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar wagon coming up their track. Ruth recognized Dr. Fairchild's distinctive carriage and waved. As the doctor approached the house, "Good morning, Elizabeth," Ruth called, using the informal address that had developed over the months of their friendship. "You're out early today." Dr. Fairchild dismounted with the brisk efficiency that characterized all her actions. "I wanted to catch you before you got busy with ranch work. I have news that I think you'll find interesting." She joined them on the porch, accepting Ruth's offer of coffee with obvious pleasure. "I've just returned from the county seat, where I attended the hearing on Ezra Hutchins's business practices." Ruth felt a familiar tightness in her chest at the mention of Hutchins's name, though the threat he had once represented had long since passed. "What was the outcome?" Dusty asked. "Complete vindication for everyone he tried to defraud," Dr. Fairchild replied with satisfaction. "The commission found evidence of systematic corruption involving at least a dozen property transactions. Hutchins has been ordered to make full restitution to his victims and is facing criminal charges." Ruth absorbed the news with mixed emotions. While she was glad that justice had been served, she found that she felt little satisfaction in Hutchins's downfall. Her energy was too focused on building her future to spend much time dwelling on past grievances. "More importantly," Dr. Fairchild continued, "the commission specifically cited your case as an example of how community support and individual determination can overcome institutional corruption. Your partnership has become a model for other women facing similar challenges." The revelation surprised Ruth more than she expected. "I never intended to become anyone's model for anything." "That's exactly what makes your example so powerful," Dr. Fairchild replied. "You didn't set out to challenge social conventions. You simply did what was necessary to save your home and build a future. But in doing so, you showed other women that they don't have to accept limitations imposed by others." As Dr. Fairchild prepared to leave, she paused at her carriage with a final observation. "You know, Ruth, when I first met you, you were a widow, trying to hold on to the past. Now you're a partner building toward the future. That transformation is worth celebrating. After the doctor left, Ruth and Dusty returned to their morning routine of planning the day's work. But Ruth found herself thinking about the changes that had occurred not just in her circumstances, but in her understanding of herself and her capabilities. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't stopped to help with that roof?" she asked Dusty as they prepared to begin their work. "Every day," Dusty replied honestly, "but I've learned that wondering about the past is less useful than planning for the future." Ruth nodded, understanding the wisdom in his perspective. The life they had built together hadn't been the one either of them had expected, but it had proven to be exactly what both of them needed. As the morning sun climbed higher, painting the prairie in shades of green and gold, Ruth and Dusty walked toward the barn where their day's work waited. Above them, the new ranch sign caught the light, its simple message marking their transformation from desperate individuals into a successful partnership. Behind them, the sounds of railroad construction provided a steady rhythm of progress, while ahead of them stretched the promise of a future built on mutual respect, shared work, and the knowledge that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships produce the most lasting success. A story that had begun with a leaky roof and a hungry stranger had become something larger and more meaningful than either Ruth or Dusty could have imagined. They had not only saved a ranch, they had created a legacy that would inspire others to take unconventional risks in pursuit of conventional dreams. As they disappeared into the barn to begin another day of shared labor, the morning light reflected off the two matching wedding bands that symbolized not just their marriage, but their commitment to building something together that neither could have achieved alone. In the end, the homeless cowboy and the desperate widow had found in each other not just salvation, but the foundation for a love that grew stronger with each challenge they faced together. The leaky roof had been repaired long ago, but the partnership it had created would last for generations, proving that sometimes the most practical arrangements can become the most profound relationships, and that courage shared between two people can overcome obstacles that would defeat either one alone.